Hey guys, welcome back to the Digital Aviator channel. Today we are going to talk about trimming. So trimming is a very important skill in flying, and I think especially in flight simulators, this is the main thing that's going to make your flying a lot more easy, because flight simulators are actually quite difficult to control, more difficult to control than real planes, because we're trying to control a sometimes pretty complicated plane through whatever control we have, and of course it's not the real thing. Now, in my opinion, trimming is the most important skill to have to make your flying easier. So it's great for the real world, but we are going to talk about trimming to make your flying a lot easier and safer in a simulator. So what is trimming? So obviously we have two ways to change the pitch of your aircraft. We have the yoke. So the yoke can be used to pitch the plane. So if I pull on the yoke, we pitch up. If I push on the yoke, we pitch down. Now what I can also do is use the trim wheel. So we have the elevator trim. The elevator is the device on the back of the plane, the flight control, this flight control right here. So it's on the back of the plane and it can hinge up and down. So as I pitch up and down, this hinges up. Now you can see there's a small hinge on the right side of the elevator. That is the trim. So basically the trim, and we can hinge that up and down with the trim wheel. The trim is basically a small mini elevator that basically allows us to pitch the plane up and down. So what's the difference between trimming and manually doing pitch? Well, with manually doing pitch, if I want to hold a certain pitch attitude, let's say I want to pitch up, I have to hold this pitch. But with the trim wheel, we can set that pitch. So I can, for example, rotate the trim wheel down, and then the indicator will go to nose up. So we now trim the plane nose up a little bit. You can see the plane is pitching up. Now the great thing about this is that we no longer have to hold the pitch ourselves to maintain that desired pitch attitude. Now I'm just untrimming what I've just did, so we fly level. But that is what trim does. Now exactly why we want to use trim may be slightly confusing. So what I would like to explain in this video is how we use the trim. So we want to actually not use the trim for climbing and descending. You don't want to use your pitch to climb or descend or to fly level. And I'm going to demonstrate why. What you actually want to use to climb, descend or fly level is you want to adjust your throttle. And this is a bit counterintuitive, so let me explain. And then of course the question comes, well, what do you use trim for then? Well, that is actually to set airspeed. So I like to call trim the cruise control of your plane. Some people call it the poor man's autopilot. So let's just explain a little bit what trim and throttle have in common, or what they actually don't have in common, and really what they do. Because understandably, there's a bit of confusion about exactly what kind of an effect throttle and trim have on your plane. So let's actually first talk about throttle before we talk about trim, because we have to understand exactly how we use the throttle to control the plane before we understand how to trim. So obviously throttle will accelerate or decelerate the plane. But that is actually not going to be what we will see on the airspeed indicator. So watch this, I'm right now at 80 knots and I'm not at full throttle. So what would happen when you think about it, if I would apply full throttle? Well, your initial thought may be that the plane is going to accelerate, right? If I apply throttle in a car, we will accelerate. So let's see what happens if I apply full throttle in this plane. So I'm going to move the throttle forward. And initially the airspeed might go up a little bit, but there's another thing happening. Look at this, the plane is pitching up. Now I am not touching the controls, the plane is doing this on its own. It's just whatever the aerodynamics are doing on the plane. And watch my airspeed, it's actually going down, because my vertical speed is up, we are climbing. So the airspeed is actually going down, because we are climbing, we are no longer going forward. Now as the airspeed went down, the plane pitched down, and that let the airspeed build back up. And now as the airspeed builds back up, the plane is pitching up again. So as you can see, the faster we're flying, the more airspeed we have, the plane actually tries to pitch up. And as we lose our airspeed, which happens right now, as we are climbing we lose some airspeed, the plane is pitching down. So if you increase your airspeed, the plane pitches up. If you decrease your airspeed, the plane pitches down. Now this does not have a really big result in the airspeed. The airspeed stayed pretty much at 80 knots here. The only thing that has changed is the vertical speed. Look at this, I'm now climbing. Now of course when I applied full throttle, the plane started to oscillate up and down a little bit. A bit of, going up and then slowing down, and then the plane pitched down and then it sped up again. So I'm actually going to cancel this out by pitching the plane down a little bit so that we accelerate to 80 knots, and then manually pitching up a little bit so that we maintain 80 knots. And now the plane is in a pretty stable situation. The airspeed is not constantly going up or down, and as a result of that the plane is not constantly pitching up or down. But what has changed is that my vertical speed went up. So I was flying level, but now I'm climbing. So throttle, yes, it will initially increase your airspeed, but as the airspeed increases, due to the aerodynamics on the plane, which I will not talk about right now, the plane will pitch up. So basically the plane automatically, due to however it's aerodynamically balanced, it's designed this way, the plane will automatically maintain a specific speed. So whenever my speed was 80 knots, which is what it was, and whenever you change your throttle, the plane is going to pitch up or down, depending on how you change the throttle, to maintain that speed. So if you lower your throttle, the plane will pitch down to maintain 80 knots. Watch this, I'm going to lower my throttle again. Now, of course, initially the airspeed will go down a little bit, but as a result of that, the plane pitches down. So I'm actually going to manually pitch down a bit more so that we go back to 80 knots. And then we are at 80 knots, I'm going to pitch back up so that the airspeed is stable. And now we are actually in a descent. So the plane has pitched down, and I just cancelled that oscillation manually, but really it's just what the plane is aerodynamically doing right now. The plane maintains roughly 80 knots, but we are now slowly descending. If I want to descend quicker, I just lower the throttle a bit more. Initially I'm going to lower the nose a bit so that we don't lose that initial airspeed, otherwise we get in that oscillation. But now we are still at roughly 80 knots, but the plane is now descending quicker. So this is the most important thing about throttle. The throttle does not directly control the airspeed. Well, I guess it does directly control the airspeed, but in the long term, the plane will, due to the aerodynamical balance we set with the trim, we'll talk about it in a moment, it will pitch up or down to maintain that airspeed. So the throttle will not in the long term change your airspeed, not very much at least. Actually, I lowered my throttle, but the airspeed is slightly higher, so that is actually not what we wanted. So remember that throttle will control your vertical speed. So let's say I want to fly level, I'm just going to apply a bit more throttle, and I'm going to pitch up manually to prevent that initial raise in airspeed. I'm lowering my throttle a bit so that we don't climb. But now we are still at 80 knots, and I have adjusted my throttle, maybe a little bit more throttle required here. So I've just adjusted my throttle, not really adjusted my pitch too much. I'm completely hands off of the yoke of my joystick. Bit more throttle, and now we are flying level again. So with throttle we can control vertical speed. So this is already one very big thing to understand about flying a plane. When you want to climb or descend, you have to adjust your throttle. So now comes the question, what does trim do? Well, trim sets your pitch, as we have learned, right? So you can see that when I was cancelling that oscillation, I pitched up or down to change the airspeed. So watch what happens if I pitch up. So I'm going to manually pitch up, I haven't touched trim yet. So yes, of course we are climbing, but my airspeed is also going down. Now if I want to keep climbing, I would have to hold the yoke back. I have to pull on the yoke more and more. And as the airspeed build, as the airspeed goes down, the plane really wants to pitch down more and more. So I have to pull more and more on the yoke. This is about how much I'm pulling right now. So I'm still climbing, yes, but my airspeed is getting quite dangerously low. We're almost below 40 knots where the stall warning will sound. There we have it. So I'm going to lower the nose here so we don't get into a stall. And as you can see, we can barely climb. We actually are descending and almost stalling. So pitching is not really a very useful way to climb or descend. But as you can see, throttle is a very useful way because the plane will aerodynamically balance itself to maintain a airspeed. So with just changing throttle, you can climb and descend without really changing airspeed. But with pitch, you can change your airspeed. Watch what happens if I pitch the nose down. So then the airspeed really builds up. Yes, we of course are initially descending, but as the airspeed builds up, so will the lift produced by the wings. So the vertical speed will actually go back up as my airspeed goes up. So it's not a very useful way to change your vertical speed by using pitch. So in other words, we use the pitch to change the airspeed and we use the throttle to change the vertical speed. So now why do we have trim? So even if you understand all of this, we still haven't touched trim. So why do we have trim? Well, let's say I want to slow down to 60 knots while staying at level flight. So if I want to level off or stay level, I would have to lower my throttle. Because right now I'm climbing, but I also want to slow down, so I have to pitch up. So I don't want to climb, so I'm going to lower the throttle. And there's 60 knots, so I'm going to let the plane kind of level off here with my throttle, and I'm adjusting my pitch so that we are maintaining 60 knots. But I haven't changed my trim. So before, when I was at 80 knots and I lowered the throttle, the plane really wanted to pitch down, and that's exactly what the plane wants to do right now. I've lowered my speed to 60 knots, but I'm holding my pitch. If I don't do that, the plane pitches down, so I'm using my pitch to maintain 60 knots. I've adjusted my throttle so that we are at 0 vertical speed. I want to stay level, but I'm pitching just enough so that we are at 60 knots, and I've set my throttle to just enough so that we are flying level. It takes a bit of practice to get used to how that works. It's just something that you have to do a couple of times to get the hang of it. But I'm pitching the plane up. It really wants to pitch down to get the airspeed back up to 80 knots. So now I constantly have to hold this yoke up, and that's not very useful, or, well, I mean, it's useful for what I want to do, but I mean, we're flying over the Grand Canyon right here. I want to do some sightseeing. I want to look around. I want to look down. Look at that, there's a little stream there. And if I look back, well, I'm actually perfectly spot on, but I would have to, really be focused on my instruments constantly. I would really want to make sure that I'm maintaining 60 knots. We're getting a little bit lower, so lower the nose. A bit more power required because we're now descending. So I'm constantly watching my airspeed and my vertical speed. And, this makes it quite hard to control the plane. I'm not really capable of doing anything else right now. I'm not capable of doing checklists, reading the charts, talking on the radio with air traffic control, navigating. There's lots of things that we need to do. Especially if you're flying visual flight rules, VFR, you want to be looking outside most of the time because you're doing things visually. You're navigating visually, you're watching for obstacles, you're watching for other planes, birds, So we don't want to constantly watch our instruments. So I don't want to constantly hold back the yoke and, really set it spot on to just the right amount of pitch required and just the right amount of throttle. So now what I can do is I can replace the nose up pitch that I'm applying manually with the trim, and that is all that the trim is used for, but it is such an important device because it clears up my mind, it frees my focus to do other things. So what I'm going to do, and I highly recommend that you have a button to operate the trim wheel, I'm going to trim the nose up. So previously I was manually holding the nose up, now I'm going to use the trim wheel to trim the nose up. And I'm going to keep trimming the nose up until I feel that the trim is keeping the pitch just so that I'm maintaining 60 knots, and I can completely go hands off the controls. So now I'm done trimming, and it takes a bit of practice to get a feel for how much you need to trim and when you need to let go of the controls. But now I've trimmed out for 60 knots. Ooh, a little bit of turbulence here. And we're still flying level, and we're still flying at almost 60 knots. The air is a little bit turbulent, so it's going up and down a little bit, but we are in a pretty stable flight right here, and I've maintained, I'm now maintaining 60 knots here. And I no longer have to do anything with my flight controls. Obviously, sometimes you have to adjust your throttle or your trim a little bit, just because the aerodynamics change with different air pressures and turbulence or whatever. But I'm completely hands off the controls. I can probably not touch my controls for half a minute, maybe even a minute, and the plane will still be at 7,500 feet roughly. The only thing is that due to aerodynamic factors produced by the propeller, the left wing usually drops a little bit, so I'm actually going to roll the wings back level. That's the only thing that I really have to do. So ever since I was done trimming, I haven't touched my controls for pitching. So this is why people call it the poor man's autopilot. We just set a desired speed by pitching and then replacing the manual pitch with the trim, and you set a desired vertical speed with your throttle. So that is how you trim the plane. So trimming is done with the elevated trim and with the throttle. So now, let's say I want to actually climb, but I want to do so at 80 knots. So I would have to speed up. Now, in order to speed up, I would have to pitch down, but of course then we will descend. So I'm also going to apply a lot of power so that we actually start climbing. So let's apply full throttle. And then as the plane pitches up, I'm going to let the plane first accelerate to 80 knots by pitching the plane down to maintain level flight for now. So now of course the airspeed builds up. The plane wants to pitch up because I've applied throttle, but I'm preventing the plane from pitching up. There's 80 knots. Now I'm going to let the plane pitch up just enough so that we maintain 80 knots. And now I'm climbing. So now what I can do is I can trim the nose down, because I had to push the nose down to maintain 80 knots. And I'm going to do so until I feel that I no longer have to hold any controls on the yoke for pitch. I've now replaced that on the trim, and now I'm again hands off the controls, and I can look outside and I can see that the plane is only barely pitching up or down. So it's just a little bit turbulent here over the Grand Canyon, but it's pretty stable. It's not going up or down very quickly. So that is an indication to me that the plane is very balanced right now aerodynamically. It's not going to change its airspeed or its vertical speed too much. Now we are pretty poorly climbing because we are in pretty turbulent air at a pretty high altitude, but we are climbing and I've changed my airspeed at 80 knots. So always remember, throttle controls vertical speed, trim or pitch, but trim is really pitch. It controls your airspeed. So what you really need to do is just get in the air in the sim, load up the plane in the air or take off, and experiment with this. Do a couple of exercises. Say to yourself, alright, I want to slow down to 60 knots. Alright, I want to speed up to 80 knots. I want to do that when I'm still level. So how do I speed up without climbing? How do I slow down without descending? How do I speed up and start descending? How do I slow down and start climbing? So you want to do some of these exercises to control your vertical speed, change your vertical speed, change your airspeed, and do so with the throttle for the vertical speed, and pitch, and as an extension of pitch, trim for your airspeed. So once you start to experiment and just do some exercise with that, you'll quickly start to get a feeling for exactly how much better the plane can be flown than constantly having to fight the pitch and fight the climb rate and fight the airspeed by manually constantly controlling the plane. So this is why it's called the poor man's autopilot, because you set it and, well, it's not really set and forget, but it's almost forget. I also like to call the trim the cruise control, because you set a desired airspeed. So first you pitch for desired airspeed and you set it with the trim, and then it's basically holding that airspeed automatically. So I like to call it the cruise control for the plane. So that is an introduction to how trimming works. So we use both the throttle and the trim wheel for the elevated trim to set the trim, the aerodynamical balance, if you want to call it that, for a plane. Anyway guys, that has been it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you found this useful. When I've learned how to trim the plane, that was definitely the most useful thing I've learned about flying in a simulator. So hopefully it's the same way for you. If you have any questions, any suggestions for other videos, please leave a comment. And if you want to help out this channel, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. That really helps out this channel grow. Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.